literarische Programm beschut wird mit zwei Organisations von Ausland, der California Institute für Jiddische Kultur und Jiddische Sprache und der Jiddische Kulturkongress in New York. Miri Koral in Los Angeles wird reden mit Anastasiya Lyubas, ein Mitglied von unser Komitee für Yiddish in Toronto und eine beliebte Lehrerin von die samen avancierte Studenten in die Klassen von unser Komitee. Today, we're really delighted to be able to partner with the California Institute for Yiddish Language and Culture, the cycle, as well, is that correct, Miri? Cycle, as well as the Congress for Yiddish Culture in New York, for a program featuring our own Anastasiya Lyubas, a member of our committee and popular teacher of our advanced Yiddish classes, in conversation with Miri Koral, director of the California Institute for Yiddish Culture and Language in Los Angeles. But before I introduce them to you, I would like to thank Sharon Power, whose name you'll see on the screen, an indispensable member of our committee. Excuse me. Her technical abilities, hard work, and dedication have enabled us to present our online programs. She's here today, behind the scenes, ensuring that things run smoothly. A devoted Yiddish teacher, Sharon is also a translator whose recently published translation of a most remarkable book will be featured in our next program on February 7th. Stay tuned. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Miri Koral and Anastasiya Lyubas. Miri Koral is a native Yiddish speaker. She has been exercising her passion for Yiddish for 25 years as an educator, translator, prize-winning bilingual writer, dialect coach for TV and film, events producer, and international speaker. With degrees from Barnard College and Columbia University, she has been teaching language, literature, and film as the continuing lecturer in Yiddish at UCLA for over 20 years. She is the founding director of the California Institute for Yiddish Culture and Language, known for offering the most active, high quality, and comprehensive Yiddish cultural and educational program on the West Coast since the year 2000. She also teaches Yiddish language at all levels online for the Workers' Circle. Her original works and translations have appeared in numerous print and online publications. Her most recent book-length translation is a biography entitled Jacob Dinazon, The Mother Among Our Classic Yiddish Writers by Shmuel Rozhansky. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank Miriam for all her effort in preparing today's program. Ich will danken Miri für ihre Warmkeit, ihr Enthusiasm und ihre Schöpferischkeit in Zugreifen unserer heutigen Zoom-Schmurs. Anastasiya Lyubas is currently a visiting research fellow at the Northrop Frye Center at the University of Toronto. She is the author of Blooming Spaces, the collected poetry, prose, critical writing, and letters of Debora Vogel, a groundbreaking scholarly collection dedicated to the work of the Polish and Yiddish modernist writer Debora Vogel. It was just published in 2020. She is also the author of White Words, Essays, Letters, and Reviews by Debora Vogel, a scholarly volume in Ukrainian, published in Kiev in 2019. A Fulbright scholar, Anastasiya received her PhD from Binghamton University. Since 2018, she has been the recipient of fellowships at the Modern Literature and Culture Research Center at Ryerson University here in Toronto, the YIVO in New York, the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. Her research has appeared in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Modernism, in Nashim, a journal of Jewish women's studies and gender studies, in the journal Translation, a transdisciplinary journal, and in the online journal In Geweb, a journal of Yiddish studies. She is an amazing young scholar who, in her academic, linguistic, and literary accomplishments, closely resembles the subject of her books and of today's discussion, Debora Vogel. And now you are about to discover it.
Thank you, Vivian. And I also want to thank the UJA Federation of Greater Toronto, and especially the Committee for Yiddish, for allowing us to have this amazing program. Just to give you a little indication of the international interconnections here, Vivian found me through a mutual colleague in Japan, Yoshi Hirose and Professor Hirose. And so here we are today. And seid begrüßt alle, neuend und weit. Welcome everyone near and far. We're delighted that you're with us today. So when Vivian approached me, I only knew, hardly anything really about Debora Vogel. And so I got to discover not only this fascinating writer and thinker, but also I get to have fun today and have a schmooze with Anastasiya Lyubas, because I so greatly enjoyed her book, which is also, this is kind of a celebration of the publication of this book, hot off the press, which is Blooming Spaces. What we're going to do today is we're going to go on a kind of a journey where we're going to talk a little bit about how Anastasiya got here in the first place and explore Debora Vogel's writing and her ideas as well as her life. If you have questions, which I'm sure you will, please, if you can, save them to the end. We think this will take about an hour or so to cover all of the ground that we would like to cover, and then we'll turn to your questions. It might be a little bit less, it might be a little bit more. We're going to be here and really, hopefully, thoroughly enjoy this topic. My apologies to those who would like to hear this in Yiddish. We could have done this in Yiddish quite easily, but we decided that we would do it in English just for our wider audience, including, I think, some students and mine and Anastasia's and others. So the first question really is, how did you, Anastasiya, embark on your journey to learning Yiddish and Yiddish literature? When did this all begin?
Thanks so much, Miriam and Vivian and Sharon. So I started learning Yiddish culture and history, as well as Yiddish language when I was an undergraduate, still in Ukraine. I was part of an interdisciplinary program in the humanities that allowed me to take coursework in addition to my major, which was translation studies. And I was taking courses at Warsaw University and Kiev University and in other universities in my hometown of Lviv. And this is really how I discovered courses on history, and specifically Eastern European history and Eastern European Jewish history in particular. So I was taking this course from Israel Bartal, who was a visiting professor at my university, and he's of Hebrew University, and the course was on Hasidism and the Haskalah. And that course really opened the whole new world for me that was very familiar, and at the same time it felt a little bit unknown and lost. So I really started with immersion in the subject matter of history. And there is another institution that was really instrumental in helping me understand something about Jewish culture and history. And that was the Center for Urban History of Central and Eastern Europe in Lviv, which does immense work and a lot of projects to educate the public about Jewish history in particular in the region. So I, in addition to formal training in Jewish history, I immersed myself in the events, exhibitions, and seminars at the center. And if I could have the second slide, please, I can show you actually project which is called the Space of Synagogues in Lviv, which is found at the site of Shul, the synagogue that was destroyed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. And here you can see a quote from Debora Vogel that's featured in an installation. Later, I went on to study Yiddish language in Binghamton in New York, and taking intensive courses at YIVO, at Naomi Prower Kadar program in Tel Aviv. I also have to mention that I became familiar with Yiddish literature also through courses in my high school, where we were reading world literature in Ukrainian translations. And this is the first time that I read Sholem Aleichem, and later went on to read him in Russian translations as well. So it was quite a journey to get to the study of Yiddish.
So if anyone hasn't quite grasped it, Anastasia's first language is not English and it's not Yiddish. It's actually, is it Russian or Ukrainian?
It's Ukrainian, but I am bilingual in Russian as well.
Russian, right. So so coming to Yiddish is an amazing accomplishment in my mind. And so Debora Vogel, how did you come across her? What sparked your interest in this writer, in this woman?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. I encountered Debora Vogel actually as a footnote. And if I could have the next slide, please. Here is two portraits. Here is a portrait of Bruno Schulz, a Polish Jewish modernist writer who's often called the Polish Kafka, and Debora Vogel. These are the portraits by the Canadian artist Berenice Eisenstein from a collection called Correspondence. And Schulz was actually writing letters to Debora Vogel, out of which his collection, The Street of Crocodiles, arose. And she was often considered his muse, somebody whose work was secondary to his. And, when I found that footnote, I was immediately intrigued. As I was thinking I was going to do all of this research on Bruno Schulz, I found myself researching all about this unknown writer from my hometown that I did not know existed, for the 20 years of my life, and just, reading up on her.
So when did you know she was something unique, unusual? What signaled this to you? And was there a work in specific that gave you this impression?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also wanted to mention before I get to that, Miriam, I went on to read about her in Polish, and I found this monograph by a professor from Wrocław University in Poland, Karolina Szymanyak, whose monograph I found at the New York Public Library, where I was browsing some work on Schulz. And if I could have the slide, please, I can show, the monograph. And this is slide with Karolina Szymaniak's work to be an agent of eternal idea, transformations of Fogel's aesthetic views. So, you know, I was intrigued that there is virtually nothing written in English about her. What signaled to me that Fogel's work was unique was when I, found that monograph, and then I went on to look at Fogel's Polish work, which is called Acacia's Bloom, or Akacja Kwitną in Polish. And I did find that original edition from 1936. If we could have the slide, I can show you the two editions, the Yiddish edition of 1935 and the Polish of 1936. And, as I started reading something that Fogel called a montage novel, I was immediately drawn in by the passage, an excerpt of which I'm gonna share in a second, which is called Streets in the Sky. And I was struck by the level of sophistication of this passage. From the get-go, it attempted to break away from any reader's expectations of a typical narrative for a novel, a novel that has the story of a protagonist at its core. And the passage also reminded me of avant-garde American and European film. Actually, that was the impression that I got from it. It was really as if I was looking at montage in the visual arts, in painting or in film. So here's the passage, which you'll see on the next slide. And the passage is called The Streets in the Sky. What you're seeing there by the side is an illustration by Henrik Strang, about whom I'm going to talk a little bit later as well. So this is the original illustration from that edition. So Streets in the Sky. That day, the streets reflected the sky, and the sky was gray and warm. And when the sky is gray, the streets are matte and sweet, like a warm gray sea. The people who found themselves on the street that day were dying for some kind of an encounter. And finally, an awkward and inexplicable longing emerged to immerse themselves in an elaborate novel, even an old-fashioned one. Surely, the novel had to open with the following sentences. That day, and on a gray day with streets like gray seas, the calendar date comes here, a man in a great coat and a black bowler hat strolled along L Street, reflecting on his life up to that point. Meanwhile, on the streets as gray as the sea, the new romance novel of ordinary life had begun, as yet unnoticed by the many passers-by. The streets in that novel smelled of elasticity, of glass, and of walking. They smelled also of something unusual, the hardness and roundness of objects. In the streets of that novel, sticky space hardened into things of unusual kinds, spheres and flat planes, mostly gray and white. The appearance of dense canvases of white space is treated like an event. Walls occur in this novel, thick like longing and sweltering heat. Walls, wider than in reality, melancholy white or hard white. And there were surfaces, spherical, square, and rectangular, in everyday nomenclature, dresses, furniture, pavement, and figures. And so the first chapter of that novel begins more or less in this way. In gray skies, walls rise, smooth like satin. Walls rise, similar to lacquer and paper. Figures walk the streets. Figures taken from the romance novel called Life. One thing I'd like to mention is that, you just heard a translation from the Yiddish text, and I mentioned that I found Fogel in Polish. And, you know, the Yiddish text of Akacja's Blian is actually very difficult to find in Eastern Europe, at least. You have to go to YIVO or the National Library in Israel for that. And you know, the two editions, the two texts, it's an interesting case of self-translation where even the sequencing in the Polish and the Yiddish and even different passages do not match, you know, entirely. They are different. So what I chose to do in my translation was actually bring out that Yiddish text as well. And I did a synoptic translation, which means that it's a translation from both the Yiddish and the Polish. And most translations that you find today of Vogel's Acacia's Bloom into Japanese or German, for example, are from the Polish text only. So what I was trying to really do is, you know, foreground that absence of that Yiddish original in reading Vogel's text.
Well, it was incredibly evocative and definitely as if she's describing a painting, right? So that connection is so clear in that passage. And so, I mean, to me, that's incredibly compelling, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you think makes Debora Vogel compelling for modern readers.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and you know, I'm asking myself why read Debora Vogel in 2021 or in 2020, and you know, a lot of people have that question, and I have a couple of reasons to give, you know, including a reason that's related to the situation that we find ourselves in and the pandemic. Debora Vogel was really a writer who was writing, you know, in the 1930s as if she were writing about 2020. And, you know, this feeling of stasis, repetition, feeling stuck, you know, in enclosed spaces, repetitive gestures and movements and actions, you know, going to a single destination, returning to the same house, you know, the banality, sort of seasonal changes, things that are usually foregrounded for her, you know, like wars, revolutions, unemployment, or you could think about the pandemic. She weaves together the experiences of the everyday, you know, in addition to these momentous events, and really abolishes the difference between what is significant and what is insignificant. She writes about modern alienation and about women's experiences of modernity. She has this way of showing a connection to technologies, mass culture, economy, and politics, which I think the reader will find not only modern and modernist, but also very contemporary. And, you know, the reason that I would say you should read Debora Vogel is if you're interested to know what it meant to be writing as an extremely well-educated and erudite woman with a PhD, a Jewish woman, who struggled with gender discrimination, financial difficulties, and multiple barriers, you know, including misogynist criticism, limited readership for her very radical experimental work in Yiddish, even as she continued to really uphold that commitment, lifelong commitment to high art, and paved her way as a professional writer in the 1930s. By reading Fogel, who I think you might think compares to Gertrude Stein. She could be called the Gertrude Stein of the interwar Poland. I think you'll discover you know, the unknown or the lesser known history of the European and American transatlantic modernism and avant-garde, and also, you know, rediscover those turbulent events of the Eastern European 20th century as well.
So given all this, how come she isn't better known? today? What happened?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And again, I think, there are a couple reasons for this. I'll try to briefly provide some context. So first of all, Fogel was only 42 when she perished in the Holocaust with her family. And, she did not have an opportunity to flee from Poland. And did not get a chance to continue her career. As a lot of female writers who had much longer writing careers, like Kadia Molodowski or Rochel Korn, for example, did. Fogel's writing career was only a decade. She became a writer when she was 30, and given that she had such a short and tragic life, she was writing very prolifically, but only for about a decade. So I think that's one of the reasons. And the second reason has to do with her inclusion or exclusion from anthologies. And think about this for a second. Everything that we read is usually a selection or a choice. Somebody made a choice to bring certain readings to us, under certain conditions. And we read largely what is available. And I think, if you think about this work, I'm really making also available readings that otherwise, people would have to go to archives for, or, hunt for rare editions and things like that. So coming back, to this question of exclusion and inclusion from anthologies, there was a whole generation of female writers beginning to write in Yiddish and publish in the 1920s. And, there is a lot of names that we can mention: Rochel Korn, Kadia Molodowski, who paved their way at that time. And there was a publisher who, Ezra Corman, who published an anthology called Yiddische Dichterins, or Yiddish Female Poets, in 1928 to represent that phenomenon of Jewish women increasingly, becoming active in the literary world. And a lot of the writers made their way into that anthology. Fogel at that time did not yet have an established literary career. She only began to write in 1928, so she wasn't part of that anthology. Her work was included in a later anthology by Mendel Neigroschel, who was a Viennese, a Galician writer from the same region as Fogel, and a Viennese Yiddish writer, and Joseph Leftwich, who published an anthology, The Golden Peacock, in 1939. He was a British critic. And, he included Fogel in his anthology. And then Fogel gets dropped from the post-war anthologies of Yiddish poetry. One of the anthologies where her name does appear, and I do want to mention that, the first time I read Fogel in English, when I was trying to find anything in English about her, was the anthology, The Treasury of Yiddish Poetry, where her work appears in Adrian Rich's translations, beautiful, beautiful translations that she did. And here is The Golden Peacock and The Treasury of Yiddish Poetry. And recently, in 2014, Catherine Hallerstein actually wrote about Fogel in her important monograph, A Question of Tradition. And hopefully that brings Fogel a little bit back into the English speaking context as well. And I just wanted to say that Fogel is actually known in Poland, but mostly for her Polish language output. And it's really my hope that she becomes much better known in the English speaking world and in the US, and really receives the readership that she deserves.
Well, your book is making a great start on that. So yeah, fantastic. Well, do you want to talk a little bit about her art related work, or would we maybe give an example of one of her works? Where would you like to start with that?
Sure. Let's talk about her art. Why don't we talk a little bit about her art criticism and her strong interest in art, and the artists that she actually wrote about. So
Was she an artist herself?
Yeah, so she wasn't an artist herself, but she was a great connoisseur of art, and it was a professional interest for her. She wrote art criticism before she wrote poetry. And she went to galleries in Paris and in Berlin and looked at the Cubist paintings of Picasso and Fernand Léger. She was inspired by the Dadaists and watched a lot of film, a lot of cinema. And she became a professional art critic around 1928, publishing a lot of reviews of exhibitions by Jewish, of the work by Jewish artists who exhibited in the Jewish Museum that was founded in Lviv in 1934. And she actually wrote reviews, not only of these exhibitions by Jewish artists. She was really interested in the Soviet film, for instance. She wrote a lot of reviews about that for the Yiddish press. And she also was on the board of the Society for the Arts in Lviv. So she was helping, mentor young artists. And I wanted to provide a couple examples to show you the artists that she actually mentored. So she was really involved, not being an artist herself. She had a lot of friends who were artists, and some of these friends were from this group called Artes. It was a group of Jewish, Polish, and Ukrainian artists. And, one of the most famous, well, at least in Poland, most famous artists from that group is called Henrik Strang. And I just wanted to say that on the cover of my book, you can see Strang's painting from 1930, which is called Surrealist Composition. So that's one example of an artist, Henrik Strang, or Marek Włodarski, as he's known by his Polish name. And if I could get some of the slides to just show you a couple of the other names that I think, you might discover along with Debora Vogel's work. These are some of the names that appear in the book as well. So Margit Selska, or Margit Reich, was an artist, one of the artists of the artist group. Władysław Szymiński was somebody who Fogel also wrote about. If we can get some of the other slides as well. So this is some artwork by Jerzy Janisz, some of his montage work, and you can see actually a poster for the exhibition of Artes group in Lviv. If we can go to some of the next slides, here's some more montage work by Otto Hahn and Alexander Riemer. And that's the work by Alexander Krzywoblocki. In the center, this is actually a portrait of Margit Reich, one of the Artes group members. So, how did Vogel become interested in art? Not being an artist herself, her journey to art was actually through philosophy. She did her PhD in Jagiellonian University. And she wrote about Hegel and his aesthetics. So that was her interest, original interest. Not being, I myself also wrote about her philosophical views on art, and I was trying to reclaim those for, the philosophical thought in my thesis, because I'm not an art historian. And I was trying to educate myself as much as I could about the artistic movements. And that was part and parcel of writing about Fogel. I think, trying to become Fogel myself, in a sense.
Well, it was an extraordinary epoch, right? The surrealism, the Dadaism, all of that. And of course, there was Chagall. And so she apparently wrote some criticism even about Chagall. Did she actually know him? Was she familiar with Marc Chagall?
So she wrote actually her longest art critical piece about Chagall, and she thought that he was, he was great because he showed a rare symbiosis between thematic richness and artistic form. And she wrote that essay for a journal of Yiddish culture and literature and the arts that, she co-edited with Rachel Auerbach in Lviv. And she actually met Chagall shortly after she published that essay when she was giving a poetry reading in Paris. And she was being introduced by actually an art critic, was somebody that she was introduced by in that reading, and his name is Hill Aronson. He was somebody who wrote in Yiddish about the Jewish artists, of the Montparnasse, and including Chagall. So I don't know if Chagall was at her reading, but she did meet him in Paris during her visit there, and she actually handed him a copy of that Zusteyer article, and he even joked that, wow, I'm impressed that Jewish poets now do art criticism. This is actually an anecdote that she recounts in some of her letters, which you can read in the book.
Well, I mean, this certainly brings to light the rich cultural life among Jewish intellectuals between the wars. The writing about modern art and the groups of Jewish artists. I mean, it's something to a large extent we need to rediscover and really celebrate. And so art obviously was a big part. What were some of the other themes of her prose, would you say, her articles and essays? And have you, Anastasia, have you basically translated everything that she wrote in this book? Yeah?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, there's still a lot that I did not include in this book. So I did have to make a selection of certain articles and essays, which ones to include. So besides her impressive output of art criticism, she also wrote a lot about pedagogy. Specifically, she was a pedagogue herself. She was one of the people in charge of the Jewish orphanage, orphanage for Jewish children in Lviv, and that theme, that topic, was really close to her heart. Speaking on different topics, pedagogical theories. So she published a lot about that. I included an essay about children's literature, by Debora Vogel, just to show her range of different topics. I think, she was truly a Renaissance woman because she wrote also on the subjects that are very relevant and sadly, relevant today, the subjects of racism and anti-Semitism. So she discussed these topics from a psychological perspective, and why do we have anti-Semitism, othering, fear of the other, and her reflections on anti-Semitism and racism feel very contemporary today. As I was giving some of the talks on these topics and talking to my friends, they told me that it feels like she was writing in 2020, or, so far ahead of her time she was on those topics. She wrote about literature. She wrote about using montage in literature in addition to photo montage. In her prose, she was really interested in showing women's experiences and gendered experiences of navigating the city space. For example, I already mentioned briefly that she was really interested in this connection between significant events that are considered historical and sort of things that are usually not in the foreground, intimate private experiences, gendered labor, things like that. If we could get up the slide of Henrik Strang's illustrations to her acacias, you can, so this was the slide with some of the essays. If we can get, yes, sorry. So that was, so these were some of the essays. I thought I had a slide with Strang's illustrations of her prose, but it's okay if that slide is not there. Oh yeah, here it is. Yeah, so in this slide, you can kind of see how Strang was trying to capture that. We see sort of soldiers that are marching, going to war, and then we also see women going to a salon, things like that. So that's really something that's visible in her prose.
Is it worth mentioning her political leanings? I mean, this was, politics was such a key element of Jewish life between the wars. I mean, was it also part of her life? Did she have strong leanings that influenced her writing, her poetry, her essays?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are a couple things that are worth mentioning. She was definitely, she wasn't part of any political movement. She didn't have a party affiliation per se, but she certainly had her sympathies. She was, a strong Zionist as a young woman studying in a gymnasium. She was part of Hashomer Hatzair organization and, wrote some of her early work in Hebrew and, some stuff that was called, there was a novel that she wrote called The Messiah, which is now lost. And that was very much part of that early period of coming to some sort of political consciousness for her. And then, she was planning trips to Palestine and things like that. Later in life, and during the time that when she was active as a writer, when she was writing, she's definitely left-leaning, not part of any organization specifically, but the venues that she publishes in. So she published in left-leaning venues that were subject to censorship by the Polish government, which was, super right-wing at that time. She was smuggling in essays about communism and, trying to smuggle them and make them somehow be published despite the censorship, despite, going through the hands of the censors. She also wrote anti-militaristic pacifist poetry and prose, which couldn't be published in Poland in the end of the 1930s. So she, she had to publish that in New York and basically abroad. And, in her essays, there is very strong evidence that she sympathizes with the early years of the Soviet Union. She's following, Soviet Union very closely, and she believes that the intellectuals and the intelligentsia should be working alongside working class. And, she feels very, very strongly about that.
Yeah, this was not an uncommon sentiment, right, among Yiddish writers and Yiddish women writers of the time. Mm-hmm. So would you like to share a particularly captivating passage of her essays? Is this a good moment for that?
Sure.
Something brief.
So if we can go to slide 15, please. I'll share one of, thank you. So I'll share a passage from her essay, which is called The Genealogy of Photomontage, which I think is very relevant today. And I just wanted to preface, this quote by saying that Fogel was really interested in the relationship between fact and fiction, which I think, we think a lot about today. And she was particularly interested in the power of literary narrative. What does literature do at a time when you have, this blurred boundary between what is fact and what is fiction? And it's important to remind ourselves that she lived at a time replete with propaganda, the world that was on the brink of war. There was hypocrisy in diplomatic relationships. Talk was cheap. And now we live in a time of informational technologies, social media, the rise of digital warfare, and all of that, the time of data. And I think, that topic of what is fact and what is fiction is still very relevant. I think what she's showing through her work and in her essays and in her creative work as well is that, fact is often a product of interpretation. So that means that, maybe facts are not that far from fiction. But what she felt strongly about is that, fictions can be dangerous. So you have to be careful, and this is what literature does. This is what's so compelling about literature, because literature is all about the power of critical thinking and about the power of imagination, and that kind of distinguishing between facts and fictions. So I'll just very briefly cite this passage. We need to understand the tendencies elevated to the level of singularly important, those which require socialization, as the legend of a certain era. Fact is a contemporary legend, writes Fogel. A question arises in art: which facts are important? Notably, the seemingly complex facts which take up a large surface of life may turn out to be pointless for life itself, and also for form as a result, even if that fact is that the person is shot. Another question is in order: is there such a thing as pure fact? Perhaps it is no coincidence that an individual fact, and even more so the selection of facts or their juxtaposition, suggest an interpretation of the raw block of life, and thus perhaps there are no pure facts.
Wow, there are no pure facts. I mean, this definitely reflects her philosophical, background and training. And is definitely a question that is so relevant for today. So let's turn a little bit to her poetry. So what do you think she set out to do, Debora Vogel set out to do with her poetry vis-a-vis modern art? And do you think she succeeded in her efforts to create this interlacing? And maybe you can share some examples of her poetry with us.
So I mentioned that, she could be considered Gertrude Stein of the interwar Poland, because what she was trying to do, like Stein, was create Cubist poetry in Yiddish. And, there are not a lot of examples of that. It was very radical, very radical experimentation that she did in her early poetry. And if you imagine, any Cubist painting, or if you think about constructivist paintings, or think about Bauhaus or any of these movements, you usually imagine a very sparse monochrome construction and infusions of really bold colors. And that's exactly what she attempted to replicate in words, create these constructions of words with a lot of repetitions. And she was trying to do the same with words as visual artists were attempting to do with innovating, with lines and colors. So this is really what she did. So I guess, Miri, I'll ask you to read an example in English for us. And this is a poem which is called Day Figure, and I'll read the Yiddish afterwards.
Great. With great pleasure. So Day Figure, a gray rectangle, a second, a third. 7 times the tin rectangle opens. Yellow sun, red sun. On one side, on another, the day rectangle has closed. Gray tin birds hover. Lumps of soft dough with 2 hands and 2 feet roll in the gray clay of light. 4 times a day. Yellow sun on one side of the rectangle, on the other. A first month of stiff tin flowers, a second, a third month of sticky tin flowers, hands and clothes. How many times it has opened, how many times closed, the tin rectangle with the yellow sun circle on both sides.
Mhm. Thank you. So the Yiddish is as follows. Togfigur, a groer rechteck, a zweiter, a dritter, 7 Mal effen sich der Blech rechteck, gelle Zoon, rote Zoon, von ein Seit, von der zweiter Seit, a Togrechteck hat sich geschlossen. Grohe Vögel von Blech schwimmen, Kletzer von weichem Teig mit 2 Händen und 2 Fies, keikeln sich in groen Leim vom Licht. 4 Mal am Tag. Gelle Sonne von ein Seit rechteck von der zweiter. An erster Heudisch von steif blecherne Blumen, der zweiter, der dritter Heudisch von klebig blecherne Blumen, Händ und Kleider. Wie viel Mal schon hat sich aufgetan, wie viel Mal sich geschlossen, der blecherne Rechteck mit dem gelben Sonnenkreisel von 2 Seiten. And I can give an example of another poem where I think she does something similar and yet something different to this, where she's trying to create a kind of ornament with repeatable nouns and repeatable numerals. And it's the poem that you'll recognize from the flyer. It's called Still Life with Seagulls. Out of the fragrant lead of sea, which ebbs and flows countless times between 2 suns, round grayness comes over 7 days, 7 days, 7 gray pearl beads, falling one by one, the first bead and the 7th. Great paper shells of seagulls ebb, flow 10 times in a row, 20 times, with the dawning of the dawn until the dusk, with a cry so round and monochrome gray like a beat of day. How can the yellow star roll every day? How can blue waves and shells of seagulls flow, and people lift their legs when every day is a single bead floating on the surface, 7 times a week. Maybe I can ask Mary to read the Yiddish.
With pleasure. Still leben mit Meves. Von dem schmeckendicken Jamblei, was geht und kommt, nicht gezählte Mal zwischen zwei Sonnen, kommt keulige Graukeit über die 7 Tag. 7 Tag, 7 graue Perlkrellen fallen einzig weiß. Erste Krell und die 7. Graue Papiermuscheln von Meves gehen, kommen, das 10. Mal, das 20. Mal, wenn die erste Dämmerung kommt, bis die 2. Dämmerung kommt, mit der Schrei, was ist keulig und einfarbig, grau wie ein Tagkrell. Wie er soll, kann alle Tag der gelbe Stern sich keikeln. Wie er soll, können gehen Chvaljes Blau und Meves Muscheln und Menschen heben die Fies, wenn alle Tag seinen ein einziger Krell, was schwimmt auf 7 Mal in der Woche. So, as always, you know, the Yiddish is wonderful, more wonderful than the English, but I have to say you did a marvelous, marvelous job with this translation. And I know for a fact how difficult poetry translation is. And really, I think you captured this spot on. And especially because English isn't even your language, right? This is another language that you have learned. So it's really quite a feat overall. I'm kind of captured by the fact that she loves numbers. She loves the number 7, yeah, a lot. I don't know if she was a mystic in any way. I mean, that's kind of, you know, often related to Jewish mysticism. The idea, the 7 numeral, and the 10 and the 20. I mean, I don't know. Do you know anything about that at all, Anastasia?
So I think her interest in numbers was not specifically from any mystical leanings that she had, but really this idea of trying to create an ornament, you know, trying to create something that's repeatable. And, you know, it's very minimalist too, to use a lot of nouns and numerals. So that's what I think she was after.
Yeah. So you also translated her work into Ukrainian, and which is also amazing, yeah, from the Yiddish into English and in Ukrainian, and so you know, each language has its own flavor, yeah. So did you find there were noticeable differences for you in how her poetry was able to be translated into these different languages?
Yeah, so for the English, I definitely workshopped my translations with a lot of people. I was one of the cohort of translation fellows at the Yiddish Book Center. And I was going to say that to translate Fogel, which is very difficult indeed, because you have a sense that in her work, every word counts. And that's true for a lot of poetry, but especially for this very minimalist poetry where, you know, every article, every noun is so specific to her vocabulary. You kind of have to imagine what she's after. You kind of have to imagine a picture that she's painting. So, you know, I often had to even workshop the translations by drawing on the whiteboard and trying to get the image, you know, that she was trying to paint. In Ukrainian, so there are translations of Fogel's poetry and prose in Ukrainian that were done by by a fellow translator, Yurko Prochasko. So what I translated was her critical work and her letters. And basically, you know, the difficulty there was translating from 2 languages, from the Polish and from the Yiddish, mainly with some work from German, and you know, trying to get across the terminology, unify the terminology that she was using. So that was the main difficulty. But there is certainly, differences in how she sounds in different languages. And now we have a lot of translations into other languages of Vogel's work as well.
Which is fantastic. So let's just take a few moments and look at her life, her life's journey. So, you kind of mentioned it early on, her accomplishments. So what would you say in a broader context that we can learn from her life's journey, her accomplishments, that maybe shed some unusual light on Jewish women in Eastern Europe during this interwar period?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think she was definitely one of the Jewish women. She was definitely unique, and she was definitely an extraordinary writer. But she was part of this phenomenon where Jewish women were increasingly getting more access to secular education. They were educated in Russian and Polish and German high schools and had access, albeit they were discriminated against when they entered universities, but they did have access to university education. And she was one of those women. There are other examples like Esther Luria, for example, who did her doctorate at the University of Bern. There's Zelda Knezhnik. Norma Fein-Pratt actually wrote about this phenomenon in her article where she was discussing American women, Jewish women that were, increasingly active in the Jewish press and publishing their work. And she said that Jewish press did a lot for American Yiddish women writers, as much as access to secular education did for their European counterparts. So I think we can learn a lot about Jewish women's history as well from Vogel's life and her work.
And what about other Yiddish writers? Did she have connections with those, both in Poland and anywhere else?
So she actually has a New York connection and a Los Angeles connection. In New York, she corresponded with the introspectivists, and specifically Aaron Glantz-Lealis, a poet of the Inzahisten introspectivists in New York. She knew Yankev Glatstein, Minkov, Teller, the introspectivists, and she published in New York. And in Los Angeles, she corresponded with Ezekiel Brownstone, who was an important publisher of multiple publications in Yiddish. And he was somebody who published some of her Parisian poetry in his journal Lied. In Los Angeles. So, there's that connection. She corresponded with writers in Bucharest, like Shlomo Bickel. Her uncle, Marcus Ehrenpreis, was the chief rabbi of Stockholm. So, we have those letters of hers that she wrote in German to him, actually. So a very rich life in letters she had. And there's, I also wanted to mention that, there's an important connection, obviously, to other women writers, Rachel Auerbach, who was her university friend, for example, and Kadia Molodowski, whom she knew, another Polish writer.
Did Rachel Auerbach write about her? And maybe not everyone knows who Rachel Auerbach was. Partly she's known as the companion, I guess, lover of Itzik Mangel, and the keeper of his works, the protector of his works. She's known for her belletriste, her work, her essays outside of the Warsaw Ghetto, and also in helping to establish the Holocaust Museum Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. So very important figure, right? during the war, post-war. So did she, and a friend of our poet today. So did she write about her as afterwards? Did she have something to say?
Mhm. Yeah, so like you mentioned, Auerbach is somebody who had a longer, writing career, but she and Fogel were university friends. They actually studied together, and were part of the same Society of Jewish Students at the university in Lviv. Auerbach wrote a memoir, which is called Unspun Threads, Nicht ausgesponnene Feder, that she published in Goldene Kate in Tel Aviv in 1960, where she talks about not just Fogel, but the whole milieu, the whole svive of Yiddish writers that she and Fogel were part of in Lviv, in Lviv. And she also, of course, talks about Bruno Schulz and Fogel, and about Fogel's decision to write in Yiddish, which Auerbach claims was partially something that she helped make happen by convincing her to write in Yiddish.
Well, this brings us to kind of the end of Vogel's life, and really the main reason why she isn't more celebrated today, or hasn't been until now, perhaps. So what do we know much about her life in the ghetto? I presume she was in the ghetto in Lviv, yes?
Yeah, so she was, dispossessed of her house. She was moved to the ghetto with her family. She had an ailing mother, and presumably that was one of the reasons why she couldn't leave the city easily, or try to escape. We don't know much about. She didn't write about her life in the ghetto. There is not much that was written about that. What we do know is that she was shot on the streets during, a horrific Nazi Aktion, as these were called, in 1942 in August, with multiple other people, and her body was found on the street. Together, she died with her husband, her son, and her mother. So that was a very tragic event. And, her body was actually found by Henrik Strang, her dear friend. And that people have written about. She was only 42 years old, as I mentioned.
Did he survive the war, Strang?
He did. So he was able to cross, he was able to flee to Poland and to Warsaw, and he got a Polish name, Marek Włodarski. He was able to cross to the Aryan side, and he had a long artistic career. And I actually was in contact with his family, trying to ask for permission to, reproduce the images of his illustrations, which were tragically lost during the war. But I actually got, Mary, you mentioned in the beginning how you met with Vivian through, your
Yoshi,
friend, a Japanese scholar and friend. And that was actually, my story with Strang's images. I got the best quality reprints of Strang's illustrations because that's the only thing that I had to work with for Vogel's Acacias, from a fellow scholar, a Japanese scholar and translator of Fogel, Araki Kato. And, I got those from Tokyo, and the permission, from the artist's family, his son and his daughter, who live in Poland and in Brussels.
So maybe Yoshi is even listening to this program, so which is wonderful. I'm sure he'll hear the recording. So hello, Yoshi, shalom aleichem, to Japan and anyone else listening in Japan as well. So I think this brings me to the end of my questions. We've covered so much ground. We have some questions from the audience. Perhaps, I don't know, Anastasia, did you have a chance to look at them? Would you like to quickly look at them and maybe we can respond to them? I just want to say, you know, this book, which I cherish now, is available with a special discount, which you can order. We'll show you the publisher's website at the end again. It's really a marvelous read, you know, this whole spectrum of poetry and these amazingly, you know, totally relevant essays. I encourage you to get this book and to know more, to learn more about this amazing writer, Debora Vogel, and in doing so, about this amazing woman, Anastasiya Lyubas, who has really, as she once said to me, devoted this labor of love into researching and translating and bringing to light the thoughts and the artistry of this remarkable Yiddish writer.
Thank you so much, Miri. It was a pleasure speaking with you today. I'll try to answer some of the questions that we have got in the Q&A box. Razel Kendib, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, has asked about biographical information about Fogel, and Faith Jones has kindly provided, you know, some biographical info from Yiddish lexicon, which has a lot of wonderful biographical information on Yiddish writers in particular. I would also refer you to my article for the Routledge Encyclopedia of Modernism, where, you know, there is a biography of Fogel, and there is, of course, a very extensive biography that I've included as part of this volume that, you know, we're talking about today, because I'm very aware of the fact that to a lot of people, Fogel may be unknown. So, you know, I did that work of really reconstructing her for the American reader and for the English reader. A question from Josh Valetsky, who was one of my teachers at YIVO. I remember, you know, the songs that we sung in Yiddish. So he's asking about Fogel's engagement with theater. You know, was she engaged with theater in any way? And that's an excellent question. But I don't know of her engagement with theater. But what I will say is that a lot of her work seems very, you know, almost choreographed, almost like modern dance or performance. And I think that comes from the multimedia nature of the constructivist movement that she was interested in. So, you know, that's, I guess, you know, that was kind of in the air, but, you know, there is no direct engagement that she had with theater per se, or, you know, Yiddish theater, for example, that I know of. Frida, thank you for your remark that it's a great presentation. A question about Janusz Korczak and if Fogel wrote about her, about his work in regard to pedagogy. That's an excellent question. She hasn't written as much about Korczak per se, but I did mention that she was active in working with Jewish orphans, and she did publish a lot of her pedagogical work in a specific venue. It was a Polish Jewish periodical that was called Przegląd Społeczny, where, she, which was specifically about, and about the topics that were close to heart for pedagogues working in institutions for Jewish orphans. And there were a lot of Jewish orphans at that time, post First World War, and, in that period that, she published in, but no essays on Korchak that I know of, but, an excellent question. Rachel Garber asks about Vogel's choice to write in Yiddish. What can I say about her use of Yiddish in her poetry, her characteristics? That's a great question. So we have only Rachel Auerbach's account of Vogel's choice to write in Yiddish. And Auerbach was a staunch Yiddishist. She wanted to get all Jewish writers in what was, acculturated milieu in Poland at that time to write in Yiddish. And, Vogel was one of them. Auerbach was trying to convince Bruno Schulz to write in Yiddish. She didn't succeed. He wrote in Polish. So we only know about her choice to write in Yiddish from Auerbach, really. We know that Vogel learned Yiddish as an adult, and her Yiddish is very, there is absence of Hebrew words. It's very Germanized, which can also be one of the reasons could be that she was from Galicia, and there was Yiddish writing in Galicia at that time, neo-romantic poets that also wrote in this kind of Germanized Yiddish. So I think the way that she was writing in Yiddish was really not your homely used volksstimmlicher Yiddish. It's not. It's the opposite of Itzik Munger, for example. That's how she was writing in Yiddish. Criticism, Faith Jones is asking about criticism of Vogel's work, which I mentioned briefly. Did major critics review her work, and what did they make of her? Yeah, so that's an excellent question. She was reviewed by the Polish critics and by Yiddish critics. And, there were some critics that were very complimentary of her work. For instance, Alquist, one of the Inzihists, very highly thought of her very highly. Aaron Glantz-Lealis actually discovered her first in Lead, so in this Los Angeles periodical where he read her work, and he kind of went on to discover more and said that, she really convinced him that Lviv was very close to New York. Other critics, Bruno Schulz wrote about her. One of the critics who was negative about her work was Yehoshua Rapoport, who thought, he didn't dig the whole stasis thing or repetition, things like that. So these are some of the critics that I'm just going to mention. So do we have time for more questions, or Miri, or should I get back to people? There's a couple of other questions that we have here. What do you think?
Maybe just a couple. Yeah, maybe.
Is there?
Let's see. How about this? Can you see this question by Bruce Anders? Yeah.
Yeah. So let me get to it. If you have it, if you could read it to me.
Sure. So he says, you mentioned a number of her contemporaries, but not Yiddish poet Anna Margolin. I perceive a lot of overlaps in their lives and work, themes of alienation, identity, and a practice of experimentation. Do you know Margolin's work, and can you comment? Excellent question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Fogel was very much aware of Anna Margolin's work, and she actually translated her work into Polish. That was, a quite extensive selection of Margolin's translations that she published. I definitely see a lot of overlaps with Margolin's work as well, especially, this attention to visuality, to imagery. Even though I think they are very different, but, both have this very sophisticated, poetic aesthetic that alludes to visual culture. So that's an excellent question. And, I definitely want to write more about Fogel and Margolin.
Okay, let's see. You mentioned children. So question from Barbara Bilson, did she write anything specific for children? Yeah,
so she didn't write.
Which is also Katja Baładowski's, right? Did that as well.
So she didn't write children's books or children's literature, but she did review children's literature in Poland and in France, and she had very strong opinions about children's books, and she thought that children's books should make children into producers. They should be interactive, which was a novel idea at that time. It was not as widespread as we know of it today. And, that's why she liked constructivist children's books that encouraged cutouts and, making different shapes, things like that. And she wrote a lot about also interesting aspects of gender and representation of women, critiquing some books for not representing, women's labor, for example, as important.
Great. And I guess I could mention that Anna Torres says that folks tuning in, watching us, might like to keep an eye out for the forthcoming special issue of the online journal in Geweb, which is devoted to Vogel's work and is co-edited by you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Anna Torres is a wonderful scholar of Fogel as well. You can read some of her work in Nashim, a journal of Jewish and gender studies, for example. And yes, stay tuned for our forthcoming issue.
Great. So I think this is a good moment to say, right, seid gesinnt, ja. Ich will euch allen bedanken für Zuhören über die ganze Zeit. I want to thank, so herzlich bedanken, Anastasia, für deine Arbeit, für deine Rede, Heint. I want to thank you for your work and your words today, which were really illuminating and interesting, and the best of luck, ja, mit dem rechten Fuß soll sein mit Mazel in Alts und alle was sind gewesen mit uns und einfach gucken auf viele später, wie man sagt jetzt oft auf Jiddisch, bleibt gesund und stark, das ist das Wichtigste, ja, be gesund. And thank you, Vivian, and the committee, the Jewish committee, and Committee for Yiddish, I should say, and Sharon, of course, for all your technical support. I don't know if you want to say something, Anastasia. The last word is yours. Das letzte Wort.
Schönem Dank, Miri, und Cycle und altweltlichen Jiddischer Kongress in New York, und Komitee für Jiddisch. Herzlichen Dank allen für den Kommen. Thank you very much to Miri, Vivian, Sharon, and all the co-organizers of this event. And thank you all for coming. And I hope that you discover Debora Vogel's work for yourself. Thank you.
And if you stay tuned, you will see where to go to get the book with a discount. Yeah, so schönen Dank.